Hi, can you hear me? Thanks everybody for joining. Today we're going to talk about how we can measure developer productivity, what are the good practices, the bad ones, and what data is actually telling us about it. Little bit about myself. I'm a lead developer at ThoughtWorks, where I've been for the last 3 years. I'm a tinkerer, a technologist, and during my spare time, I'm an animal rights activist. Here you have the QR code for my LinkedIn, if you want to add me. Briefly about ThoughtWorks, we are a consultancy company with over 30 years of experience. We started in the US, but now we are spread all around the world. We are always looking for the toughest problem, technological and known, that you have at hand, where you start feeling some despair and you don't know how to get out of there. We are really eager to help you with that. During our trajectory, we created some tools that you might be familiar with. So, for instance, we invented the first CI tool back in the 2000s. We created Selenium, and most recently, we devised the Tech Radar, which you might be familiar with, which is a tool that you can use to provide some enterprise architecture guidance in a non-prescriptive way. It's an open source tool, so you can create your own Tech Radar, and you can always, of course, refer back to the main ThoughtWorks one, where we collect all the feedback from our clients, and we devise this Tech Radar with our idea of what technology will look like in the future. Finally, for whatever technical or non-technical topic you can think about, we've written the book about it. We have over 100 books published on O'Reilly on all sorts of topics. So we are always pushing the envelope when it comes to technological excellence. The agenda for today will be quite straightforward. So the title says the good, the bad, and the data, but it makes more sense to start with the bad. So we'll start with the bad practices, then we'll look at what good looks like, and then finally we'll analyze some data and see what actually we can do to implement the best practices. So we have some introductory notions we need to be aware of. Please have a look at them. The only one that is extremely important and we should remark is the one at the top right corner, bottom right corner. So when we measure developer productivity, we don't want to measure how much each developer is contributing, but we want to measure the way a developer can contribute to the team and to the organization in a frictionless manner. We also need to be aware of the difference between those 4 key concepts. So input and effort are what we actually spend in order to get an activity done. The output is what we actually get as a result of the activity. This could be a piece of code. It could be a piece of documentation. The outcomes are the actual result that we get from those outputs. And finally, the impact is the business value that we'll get out of it. So it's important to always think in terms of outcomes and impacts rather than in inputs and outputs. How many people here are familiar with the McKinsey articles about measuring developer productivity? 1, 2, 3. Okay, very succinctly, McKinsey published an article saying, yes, you can measure developer productivity, meaning that I can score you against him and say, you're a better developer, you should get a raise, you should get fired, or, sorry, no raise for you this year, which is antithetical to everything we think about software development, right? Because if we start scoring 2 developers against each other, why would you help him if you know that your promotion or your salary increase will depend on that? And the McKinsey article is very simplistic in the way they are selling this service, because McKinsey is really about selling services. And of course, it really resonates with the higher ups that they want a clear measure. They want to know who they should promote, who they should fire, and who should get a raise. But the real world is not as simple. So in the article written by McKinsey, they are really focusing on inputs and outputs, so measuring what comes in and what comes out as elementary measures. The problem with this is that developers are smart, on average, but we are also quite cunning. So once we know how our productivity will be measured, we'll devise strategies to maximize that measure. So if we measure the number of commits, the number of pull requests, the number of deployments, we will make sure that that will be the highest possible number. So if we need to do 1,000 commits per day, that's fine. We can do 10,000. And then the money will come in, right? And there's also a misconception about how much time developers should spend coding. So if we see developers as coding machines, it makes sense that we should be spending at least 70 or maybe even 90% of our time coding, because that's where we provide value, right? But I think if you are here and you are trying to learn more about the development world, development life cycle, the best practices, you know that coding is actually the easy part of our job. The difficult part is understanding the requirements, understanding the business, working in an agile manner, collaborating, finding trade-offs. Coding is just the final bits. And at the end of the day, you can do it more or bad, more satisfactory or not, but it's not the most difficult part. Once you implement those sort of measures, like measuring commits or measuring elementary values, you can also lose the trust of the developers, because they feel like they are being surveilled, they're being controlled, and they don't have the freedom to operate in the best possible manners. So people will start feeling disengaged, people will start considering moving on to the next job in their career. If you have individual measures for developer productivity, you start seeing a rank between developers. So developers not only will start having manipulative behavior, so they'll not foster collaboration, they'll try to obstaculate each other, they try to get the best numbers, because they'll be scared for their job, for their promotion, for their career. And that's not where we want to be in a development team. Finally, these sort of measures do not put a human developer first. They just want to have a cold number defining how good a developer is. But there are so many different dimensions in how we assess how a developer is performing. If somebody is spending 100% of their time unblocking other team members, with these measures, the productivity will be 0. Does that mean this developer should be fired? Most would argue that's not the smartest move, because then somebody else will have to take that spot, that uncomfortable spot, because it won't be easy, with the idea that they'll be fired next. So we are not really promoting cooperation in this environment. Finally, this approach from McKinsey is not considering qualitative data. And by qualitative data, we mean inputs as surveys, so asking developers, do you have all the tools you need? Do you have all the knowledge you need? Do you need additional training? Is the atmosphere in the team pushing you to do your best possible job? Or do you have constant roadblocks? We don't get that sort of information. We just look at the numbers, and sometimes developers don't have a say in how we can remove those obstacles. These metrics also do not value if a well-being if an employee is having enough focus on well-being. So if there's like mental health problems, or if a developer is constantly pushing to get to the most recent deadline, we don't factor for that. So we are not taking the holistic picture of productivity. We are just trying to get a cold number. The concept is explained better here. So once we try to optimize for individual productivity, we are actually looking at a local optima. We are trying to find a localized solution, but we are not seeing the problem in its entirety. We are not trying to optimize at the team level, the division level, or at the organization level. And of course, this means that our final solution will not be the best one we can get to. So what can we do instead? We discussed at the beginning about inputs and outputs. We should shy away from those set of measures. We should much rather focusing on outcomes and impacts. So essentially, how are we impacting the business? How are we making the business better? What sort of value are we delivering to our customers? If we have the same sort of measures across teams, we can then try to define which team is working better, not in a way to say this team is not performing up to par. We need to take measures, but just to share the best practices across teams and finding some roadblocks that a team might have and how to solve them. We then have a number of metrics that are quite common nowadays in the industry that can help us with these set of measures. So we have the most famous, the DORA metrics, or the 4 key metrics. And those are very, they're quite cold measures. They are just numbers, but they help us drive efficiency within the team. It's true that they don't say anything about the business value. So for instance, we might deploy to production 200 times a day, but how is that actually helping the business? Should we do it if the business is not getting any value out of it? So we can look at other frameworks such as SPACE and EEBO metrics that link those quantitative metrics, meaning that they only look at numbers, with other dimensions such as the employee satisfaction, such as the business value. Especially EEBO provides a line of sight between the technical measures and the business measures. So you have a link between those two sets. Now, if we look at the team level, we can then see that we have more accuracy. The example from before where we had a single developer rescuing the rest of the team, it's not an ideal condition, but the metrics there will tell a very different story from the reality. But if we look at the team level, we can see how the team is performing. So it's important to look at the team and not at the individual. We can then focus on the best tools and practices. So we shouldn't try to save money whenever there's a need for a new tool. We should try to get everything the team needs, up to reason, of course. And then we should try to foster measures for work-life balance. We shouldn't have the team being always on call, always available, overworked. And an important concept here is bearing in mind what sprint actually means, because when we think about sprint, it feels like we should be running very fast, but we cannot sustain this velocity over time. We need to think of our lives as software developers as a marathon. Is it from outside? Huh? Okay. I really suck at dancing, so I won't even try. Should we? Sorry. Should we pause? Should we pause? Yeah, let's pause. Can we continue? Awesome, thanks. Right, apologies for that. So we are saying that a sprint should be seen as something we need to take at a leisurely pace. We need to be able to sustain that pace over time. So there's no need for us to overstress and overwork ourselves just to meet a sprint deadline. It's a fictitious deadline. We need to make sure we prioritize work-life balance. Now, when we look at the data, we can have a lot of insights that we can then implement into our teams. The data is from the DevOps report, and for many dimensions, I've summarized the result with a scale. So 2 pluses means there's a strong positive associations between the 2 facts. Then 1 plus is a positive association. A plus and a minus means it's not associated, so there's no relationship between the 2. And then down to 2 minuses, which means that they are strongly inversely related. The first thing the DevOps report tells us is that a very big and important step we can take is to implement a generative culture. And the generative culture starts from the top, meaning that the CEO, the board of directors, need to grant the liberty to their reports and to their teams to act and implement the directives in the best way they see fit. So in a generative culture, we have the boss determining some very high-level goals, and then they don't get involved in the day-to-day operations, and they let their teams define how to get there and meet those objectives. So we can see, for instance, that when we have generative cultures, we have a strong improvement in team organization and operational performance. The same for software delivery performance. Continuous improvement and continuous delivery also see a significant uptick. The job satisfaction and the productivity improve dramatically, and we have a significant effect on lowering the burnout. Next, how many people here are familiar with the UX concept? Quite a few, so just quickly for the others. When we build something with UX in mind, it means that we are building something for the user. We already know which kind of personas we have, what the user wants, what their pain points are, what their dreams and aspirations are. So once we have this UX built into our products, we see that the team's performance and productivity significantly improve. That leads to a higher job satisfaction. So not only we deliver better, but our developers also become happier because they understand what the user wants and they see the value they are providing. How many people here do code reviews? Trunk-based development? I see somebody has raised their hands twice, so I'm curious to know how that works. But once you do code reviews, you are essentially asking somebody else to validate your work, and oftentimes that person does not have the same context you have. So they will need to find their time, the time out of their schedule. They need to read the story. They need to understand the business requirements. They need to read the code. Sometimes it might even be needed to run the code locally. So we are looking at a time span of a few hours to a few days. And what do you do while your code is being reviewed? Do you start a new story? Do you wait? Most people usually start a new story, and then they need to switch between branches. And essentially, you have a very high transition cost, mentally and physically. You don't get the satisfaction of closing your story. You keep going back and forth, and this, of course, leads to a high level of burnout, as we can see here. Another point is once we implement microservices, that will allow us in a similar setting to deliver whenever we want. We don't need to wait for approvals from a different team. We don't need to wait for other changes to be in. We are just free to deliver whenever we want. And of course, this has a significant impact on burnout. AI does not seem to have that big of an effect yet. At the individual level, they are helpful, but at the group level, it's still unclear. So those tools are still quite new, and the impact hasn't been seen yet. The next is quite surprising. So having quality documentation also reduces burnout and improves productivity. Who would have said, right? Now, when we go back to trunk-based development, for trunk-based development here, we mean working only with master, so not creating short-lived branches. All the team writing directly master, so pulling, pushing with one single branch. If you do that and you have very good documentation, that increases your performance 12 times. Another thing we can look out for is reliability, so meaning that once we deploy our code to production, how many support calls we have, how many people we need on the rotational shifts, how many people need to be on the 24/7. And here it's very important to follow the practices from team topology, whereby a team that writes a code ships it and maintains it. So they are the one responsible for the 24/7. If there's an incident at nighttime, they need to be the one that are waking up, so that next time they'll avoid the same mistake. If somebody else has to fix it, there's no feedback loop, or the feedback loop gets so big that the development team is not encouraged or is not pushed to do better next time. Important things to implement are blameless postmortems. How many people have done them after a production incident? Quite a few. So the main difference with a regular postmortem or with an incident report is that you get all hands on board and you try to understand the reason why it happens, and you want to get to the point where the reason is the lack of an automated process. So most likely it was a human error, 99% it was a human error, but you want to remove the human from the equation so that it doesn't happen again. And you don't want to blame the individual that made the mistake, but you want to blame the process that was involving a human in that loop. The next one is infrastructure, flexible infrastructure, actually. So once we started talking about the cloud 15-ish years ago, we thought that all our problems will go away and somebody will maintain the data centers, will take care of switching out racks, disks, and so on. And that's true up to a point. What the data shows, though, is that if we don't use flexible infrastructure, we are suffering the exact same problems we are having when we are maintaining our own data center. And by flexible infrastructure, we mean that infrastructure that can scale up and down and that can be provisioned on demand. So if you have, for instance, to onboard a new client, you can automate the provisioning and the system can scale up and down, can scale down at night, for instance, so that you have a smaller cost. If we don't do that, there's no difference between working on-prem or working on the cloud. In addition to this, having flexible infrastructure reflects with a strong association with the organization and team performance and the software delivery performance. But again, this is only if you use flexible infrastructure. It's not enough to have a VM on the cloud and say that you have flexible infrastructure. How do you distribute the code? How do you distribute the work in your team? I've seen teams where the team lead or the tech lead is assigning the work and people just need to accept whatever they're assigned to. This can lead to frustration and burnout because people cannot choose what they want to grow into next. So if I'm a backend developer working on a team that uses React, and I really like React, and I think it's my next area to grow into, but I never get a React story because the tech lead doesn't think it's good for me. Then I get frustrated, and I might even consider leaving the team. So the idea here is that the distribution should be done fairly, and the best and perhaps the simplest thing here would be to let people choose their own stories to work on. If we don't, there's an additional risk for minorities and underrepresented groups, because the tech lead might decide women are better for front-end, and you want to avoid those sort of biases in the first place. So letting people choose is the best and safest option. How many people are familiar with developer experience? Okay. Almost everybody. Very quickly, with developer experience, we mean providing the tool and the process needed for the development teams to be able to create new projects, come on board, and deliver value quickly. So usually you have an internal platform team that serves the development teams and provide basic building blocks for platform, for infrastructure, for pipelines, for observability, so that every team does not need to reinvent the wheel. This starts making sense once the organization has reached a certain size. The size can vary depending on what the organization does and how much difference there is between the different teams. Of course, the more shared things they do, the most value you get out of a platform team. If every team is doing something different or in a different tech stack, a platform team can only do so much. So having a development experience team and processes in place have a lot of advantages. So we can see that it increases psychological safety, productivity, satisfaction, and engagement. And of course, those are all well-being metrics. Those are metrics that make the people in your teams more engaged with the company and the process, and they will make them stay longer and be more satisfied and more productive while they are at your company. So how can we select the right metrics? We discussed about quantitative metrics, which are hard numbers that we can essentially get from our CI/CD system. We can measure how often we deploy, what's the time between failures. Those are numbers we can get from an automated process, and we should mix them with qualitative metrics, which are numbers that are inferred by means of a survey or by text inputs or by direct feedback. So if we have, as an example, a developer experience team, what sort of metrics could we have for this team? The first thing to do is to define what kind of signals we should look for, we should look out for. So essentially, what are the inputs, what are the signals that will actually tell us if you're doing a good job. So for instance, we can think about how easy it is to use the development experience products, how quickly a team can get onboarded into these products, and what is the quality. What's the number of bugs, what's the number of support calls requested. We'll circle back on this in a moment. So for each of those categories, or the signals, we need to define the metrics that are required for measuring it. So for instance, for speed, we can think about the perceived delivery speed. We can think about the perceived productivity. When it comes to developer experience team, there's a more complicated concept when it comes to speed, and that is due to having a clear definition of done. So development teams work for other internal developer teams, so it's not always clear when they're done with their work. Because once they push their change, there might be no other team using them, or there might be just a subset of those teams. So you see getting bugs and suggestions for improvements coming at a later stage. So you need to make sure that you are measuring once you are done and how much you've done. So that's why the perceived speed is a good measure in this case. When it comes to the ease signal, how easy it is to deliver using the building blocks from the development experience team, the build failure rate, how often a pipeline fails. Then when we look about quality, we can have the number of incidents or the perceived quality. We can then have additional operational metrics that are outside of those signals, but are still useful to measure, like the developer satisfaction. Here, the survey is the best possible tool we can gauge how developers are satisfied with our tools. So for instance, whenever there's a new release, we can ask developer teams to provide input on their satisfaction and even potentially constructive feedback on how we can become better at sharing the updates or incorporating their suggestions. So today we covered a lot of grounds, and I know it's such a big area, it's difficult to wrap our head around it. So these are my main considerations. So if you take away 3 points from today, here they are. So it's a waste of time, and it's even counterproductive to measure the productivity at the developer level, because we said developers are incredibly smart, but also cunning, so they'll try to cheat the system. They'll get the raise, but you won't get back what you paid for. You need to have metrics at the team level, making sure that the best practices you have in a team are then exported into the teams that is not implementing them. And conversely, if you have a team experiencing a roadblock, you should share it with the other team, trying to find a possible solution there. If you have standardized measure to measure developer productivity, you can start ranking teams against each other, but always with the goal of trying to improve the overall efficiency, not to understand who's better. And finally, the main goal should be to drive an increase in the productivity of the entire organization. So not a specific team, not a specific developer, because if we do that, we will be looking at improving over a local optima, not the global one. So that's it. You have a QR code for the survey on the left, so I really encourage you to give me feedback, both positive and constructive. I especially value the constructive one, so please do it. And you have the slides here on the right, so they are available for you. So any comment on the slides, on the presentation, it's more than welcome. Just so you know, here we have a lot of additional material, so all the sources I've used for the presentation are linked here. There are quite a few. Then you have like the explanation of what DORA, EBO, SPACE, metrics are. SPACE is a framework, so the measures can actually be different. And then McKinsey, and I think that's about it. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Any question?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. So my question is about how open do you think it makes sense to be with these kind of metrics? I mean, would you publish this for every team to know, or is there any reason why you wanted to, I don't know, hide somehow? That's the question.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I think it's better to make them public within the organization, of course. But it's good that the teams understand what's going well and what's not going very good, so they can also course correct. So if team A is doing very well in deployment frequency, for instance, but they're not delivering value, of course there's something that is not quite right. So we need to understand why they're deploying so frequently, for instance, but also why they're not delivering value. And perhaps you have team B that is doing the opposite. So they can both learn from each other, but they will need to be aware of where their team is doing something excellent and where they're lacking, so that they can improve. And of course, it's the responsibility of the tech leads, team leads, also the individual developers, and also the people they are reporting to, making sure that their teams are delivering value in a similar way, and then optimizing so that they can all improve their performance over time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, thanks a lot for the presentation. My question maybe is very naive, I apologize, but in your last conclusions, it was mentioned like if you have consistent processes, then you can compare teams. So if you don't have consistent processes at all, is there still anything what would be, and it's not feasible to attempt introducing them. Is there something, could still something be done?
So I can give you an example, for instance, and you tell me if I understood it right. So in an organization, you can have some of your teams working on a legacy code base and some other teams working on the new shiny projects. Does that resonate?
Yes, yes. Plus, there is also high diversity in the way how teams work in general, because teams are very autonomous. Plus, there is a rush. There is no time to invest into, I don't know, tracking metric. Well, all the factors, no? But at the end, it results in yes. So what you said is one of the factors. Yeah.
So first, it would be important to carve out the time to have those metrics in place, especially the 4 key metrics. It's true that they don't provide much business value, but they're very, very easy to implement. So that's something you can do probably in a few days, and it's something that is a quick win. And from there, you can perhaps extend it into business metrics as well. Now, when you have 2 very disparate set of teams, it doesn't really add much value if you compare them against each other, right? Because if you have a monolith that is very slow to deploy, and then you have microservices, provide a comparison between those 2. It's good to know that you need to invest more in the monolith modernization, but beside that, you cannot say to the teams working on the monolith, why are you so slow while the new teams are deploying 100 times faster? It's not up to them. It can provide good insights into the business reasons why you should modernize, so that you can go to the market faster and deploy quicker and respond to customer needs in a more agile way. But you cannot say to the development teams to change their ways of working based on a completely different paradigm. So there it would be good to group the teams. So you can still do comparison between the teams working, for instance, in the monolith and the teams working in the new microservice approach. And you can still apply all those set of practices, but you need to be aware that cross-references between those 2 groups will not provide much value, beside the incentive for modernize the older part.
Makes sense.
Did this answer your question?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Then thanks everybody for joining.